The first chill of autumn crept into the air, painting the trees in hues of gold and crimson, and I found solace in the simple task of stacking firewood. Each log felt solid and reassuring in my hands, a promise of warmth for the cold nights ahead. My little corner of the neighborhood, just beyond the well-manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, held its quiet charm, but even here, the whispers of conflict were never far behind. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association, was a creature of habit. Her presence was an inevitable shadow, lurking in the periphery of our lives like an ever-present cloud. Her reign was marked by meticulously penned notices about lawn heights and stern warnings against audacious paint colors. Yet, this time, her sights were set on something new. My firewood, stacked neatly beside the garage. The pile was an emblem of preparation, a bastion against the encroaching frost, but it seemed to provoke something in Karen, kindling a different sort of fire within her. With the dexterity of a hawk and the persistence of a woodpecker, she swooped in, her intentions as clear as the crisp autumn air. The HOA guidelines she frequently brandished made no mention of firewood aesthetic, but that mattered little to someone who thrived on imagined infractions. Her first strike was subtle. A note slipped through my door like an unwelcome draft, a reminder. She called it about community standards and tidiness. I sighed at its predictability, its pettiness, words that attempted to cloak pettiness in the guise of order. But I chose not to engage. I chose calm. Days passed, and my pile dwindled mysteriously, logs disappearing as if spirited away by some nocturnal forest creature. I knew the culprit. Her disdain was palpable, a palpable presence tickling the back of my neck as I surveyed the diminished stack. She must have thought herself clever, a robin plucking away at the edges of my patience. I could have responded with anger, perhaps a confrontation in full view of those who whispered about such matters. But I found no peace in shouting matches or raised voices. I had my own way of handling these skirmishes. No need for fire, just a quiet, steady resolve. It was time for my own subtle maneuver, an attempt to remind her of the consequences of meddling. Hollow logs, cleverly crafted to appear solid and tempting, would replace the neatly stacked wood. Inside, ants would wait, eager to spread chaos in their own industrious way. There was a kind of poetry in it, nature's smallest warriors, ready to march, a gentle reminder of who truly held the reins of consequence. I stood back, surveying my work, and felt a calm satisfaction settle over me, a silent vigil in the twilight, waiting for the unfolding of my quiet rebellion. For now, I would enjoy the stillness, the fleeting peace before the storm. The firewood was no longer just fuel, it was a testament to patience, a monument to the art of quiet resistance. Let her take her spoils. The real reckoning would come soon, and I would be ready. The morning light unfurled itself over the neighborhood like a pale, golden carpet. I sat by the window, sipping coffee that was a tad too bitter, watching the world outside come alive with routine. Birds darted between trees, and the occasional car ambled past, its tires whispering on the pavement. But this tranquility was deceptive. Beneath the sheen of neighborhood perfection lay an undercurrent of tension. I could sense it, a tight string pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. Karen had been busy. Her zealous hands were at work, meddling with the delicate fabric of suburban peace. The first sign of her escalation arrived in the form of a crisp, white envelope, slipped under my door like a snake, a citation for an overgrown lawn. I chuckled to myself, a sound dry as autumn leaves. My grass was trimmed to regulation perfection. But Karen had her own version of the truth, a truth that bent to her will, like a sapling in a storm. I could almost see her, prowling the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and predatory. Her power was not in her authority, but in her ability to wield the rules like weapons. The HOA guidelines became her personal arsenal, and she swung them with abandon, targeting anyone who dared to defy her reign. Days passed. And the citations multiplied like weeds. Trash cans left out a minute too long, a barely visible crack in the driveway. Each notice was a badge of defiance, a testament to my refusal to dance to her discordant tune. I tacked them to my kitchen corkboard, a growing mosaic of absurdity. Whispers began to circulate like a cold breeze. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Their greetings were curt nods, wrapped in layers of unspoken fear. Karen's influence was spreading, a dark shadow creeping across sunlit lawns. She was a maestro of gossip, conducting a symphony of suspicion and doubt. I watched her from my window, orchestrating her little army of compliance. She led them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A veneer of friendliness stretched over a core of iron. She was a force of nature, relentless and unyielding, but every storm runs out of rain eventually. My plan was simple, elegant in its quiet devastation. The hollow logs, strategically placed, were not meant to cause harm but to serve as a reminder that power, wielded without restraint, corrodes the soul. The ants were nature's accomplices, working tirelessly, blindly, oblivious to the chaos they would soon unleash. The neighborhood buzzed with the subtle hum of anticipation. There was a shift in the air, an electric charge that prickled the skin. Karen's fortress of control was beginning to show cracks, tiny fissures that would soon widen into chasms. One morning, the universe aligned in an act of poetic justice. Karen's meticulously manicured lawn was alive with chaos. Ants swarmed in chaotic patterns, turning her green paradise into a frenzied dance of legs and mandibles. It was a living tapestry of nature reclaiming its territory. I watched from my window, sipping my coffee, the bitterness now replaced with a hint of satisfaction. Karen stood on her lawn, her clipboard limp at her side, eyes wide, mouth agape. It was a tableau of disbelief, a silent scream painted on her face. Her reign was faltering. The neighborhood held its breath, watching the queen of order brought low by tiny architects of entropy. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a whisper of justice carried on the wind. And so, the scales began to tip, not with a roar, but with the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting barbed shadows across the living room floor. I'd always loved this room, but now it felt like a stage, each piece of furniture a prop, every shadow a reminder of the drama unfolding outside. Karen had taken my firewood, and with it, any illusion of neighborly peace. In this meticulously planned community, the firewood was more than just fuel. It was a symbol of comfort, warmth, and self-sufficiency. But Karen, with her ironclad HOA rules, had decided it didn't meet the aesthetic standards she championed with religious fervor. I watched from the window, sipping my coffee, as she strutted past my driveway, her gait exuding an unearned authority. Her every step demanded attention, like a self-appointed queen inspecting her realm. The previous night, after spotting the empty space where my neatly stacked wood had once been, I'd formulated a plan, not impulsive, not reckless, calculated. The old logs in my garage, long forgotten and riddled with tunnels of industrious ants, suddenly found their purpose, hollowed out and decaying. They would serve as a fitting replacement for the confiscated stack, a subtle counter, a lesson in humility disguised as compliance. I documented everything with the precision of a detective, photos of the empty yard, the untouched garden bed where the woodpile had been, the date and time stamped on each image. These details mattered, my evidence, armor, against the next inevitable HOA summons. The irony was rich. Karen's insistence on a picturesque neighborhood was about to backfire gloriously. She wouldn't see it coming not until the ants made their presence known, a tiny army, working silently from the inside out, undermining her picture-perfect world. I prepared the logs with quiet satisfaction. The ants, undisturbed, continued their diligent work even as I loaded the logs into my wheelbarrow. Their persistence was admirable. If Karen could embody even a fraction of their industrious spirit, perhaps she'd be a tolerable neighbor. The logs found their new home in her backyard. Neatly stacked at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, I imagined her delight at seeing my apparent compliance. Mistaking my actions for submission, the thought brought a wry smile to my lips. The lawn was immaculate, each blade of grass uniform. The garden an explosion of color meticulously orchestrated, a stark contrast to the chaos soon to boil beneath the surface. I could almost hear the tiny mandibles clicking, a symphony of subtle sabotage. As I stood there, surveying the scene, I wondered if Karen would ever realize the futility of her crusade, the pursuit of control, order, perfection. It was a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the smallest of creatures. Ants knew this. Perhaps one day, Karen would too. But, for now, I would wait. For the day she found her pristine lawn teeming with life she couldn't control. Wait for the moment she realized her dominion was nothing more than a facade. The anticipation was oddly satisfying. I turned back toward my house, leaving the wheelbarrow behind. The sun had risen higher, and the shadows were shrinking, retreating from the light. As I closed the door, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. My stage was set. The play, now, was her move. The morning sun filtered through a lattice of skeletal tree branches, casting fragmented shadows across the suburban sprawl. I stood at the edge of my property, surveying the quiet tableau, a silent movie in muted hues. Across the street, Karen's house sat like a fortress, its pristine facade an ironclad mask for the chaos that simmered beneath. The neighborhood had begun to buzz with a low, persistent hum, a whisper of discontent carried on the wind, weaving through hedges and over white picket fences. The ants had done their work well, carving out kingdoms within the hollow logs I'd planted on Karen's front lawn. Now, the tiny invaders were making their presence known, marching in regimented lines that spoke more eloquently than words ever could. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as Mrs. Hargrove next door juggled a phone and a clipboard, her eyes darting with the urgency of a sparrow caught in a storm. Everyone had felt the ripples of Karen's actions, the casual theft of firewood a mere echo of her broader reign. She wielded the HOA with the zeal of a zealot, a queen enthroned in plastic lawn chairs at meetings no one wished to attend. But now, the kingdom was turning. The first signs of rebellion were subtle. John, from 2 houses down, began trimming his hedges in defiance of the HOA's arbitrary height restrictions. A few doors down, the Johnsons painted their shutters a rebellious shade of teal. It was as though some unspoken pact had been formed, each act a small stone in a growing avalanche. I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. The irony was not lost on me. Karen had always believed herself untouchable, yet here she was, besieged by an army of ants, the perfect metaphor for the quiet uprising taking shape around her. A car pulled into Karen's driveway. Her husband emerged, briefcase in hand, his face a mask of weary resignation. I imagined the tense conversations behind closed doors, the seething blame cast like grenades across the dinner table. It was almost poetic. The ants, undeterred by the human drama unfolding above, continued their march. I watched as they carried their tiny burdens across the concrete, a testament to persistence, to the notion that even the smallest of creatures could topple giants if only they worked together. I could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tilting of scales. The neighborhood was awakening, its residents shedding the complacency that had allowed Karen's tyranny to flourish. It was a dance of subtle defiance, one I was content to observe from the sidelines. Just then, Karen herself appeared, stepping out with the air of a general inspecting the troops. Her gaze swept across the street, eyes narrowing as they passed over my porch. Our eyes met briefly, and I managed the faintest of nods, a ghost of a smile flickering at the corners of my lips. For a moment, I thought she might march over, her heels clicking a staccato of indignation on the pavement. But she hesitated, the ants a living barrier that kept her at bay. It seemed even she recognized the futility of her position, her empire crumbling beneath the weight of tiny legs. I turned back toward my house, leaving her to contend with her unwelcome guests. The neighborhood was changing, and perhaps this shift would bring something brighter, something more just. As I closed the door behind me, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan well executed. A silent promise whispered on the breeze that even the smallest acts of defiance could light the way to change. The morning after the great log swap, the air was crisp. Carrying a hint of autumn's impending arrival, I found myself sipping coffee on the porch, gazing at the neatly stacked pile of firewood that remained untouched in my yard. The memory of Karen's shock still amused me. The way her perfectly painted nails had trembled as she discovered the ant-infested surprise. Subtle justice, the kind that skitters away when exposed to light. I watched a squirrel dart across the yard, its tiny paws a blur of activity. Much like my mind had been in the days leading up to this moment, Karen's theft had sparked something in me. Not rage, but a quiet determination to restore balance, to remind her, and perhaps myself, that actions have consequences. I had been methodical, not just in the execution of my plan, but in the quiet steps that followed, a gentle consultation with a lawyer, whom I met over tea at a small cafe. Her advice had been soft-spoken, but clear as crystal. The law is often a slow-moving stream, but it carves through stone in time. Karen's wrought iron gate, usually standing proudly ajar, guarded her domain with a self-assured arrogance, but today it seemed timid, knowing what was coming. The papers I had filed were discreet, a reminder that the rules she wielded like a sword could also be her undoing. The legal dance was subtle, almost poetic. It required no grand gestures or public battles, just a quiet persistence, a series of nudges in the right direction. I had documented everything: dates, times, even a few strategically taken photographs of her midnight escapades. Evidence, when gathered patiently, is a powerful thing. As days turned to weeks, I observed the slow shift in Karen's demeanor. The whispers between her and the board grew more frequent, their tones less certain, tinged with a hint of desperation. Her fortress of control was beginning to crack, and she sensed it, like a cat watching its reflection in a pond, the image warping with the ripples. The moment of confrontation came, not with a shout, but with a rustle of envelopes. The HOA meeting was a quieter affair than usual, the usual smugness replaced by a curious tension. Karen, seated at the head like a queen on a chessboard, received her formal notice. A single line, spoken softly, cut through the room. Your position is under review. There was no need for drama. Silence speaks volumes. Her eyes flicked to mine, a mixture of disbelief and anger. But I merely offered a slight nod, a nod of acknowledgement, of understanding, of inevitability. The meeting ended shortly after, the members dispersing like autumn leaves caught in a hesitant breeze. I lingered for a moment, watched as Karen's carefully constructed world teetered on the brink, and then quietly stepped away. My work here was done. Outside, the air was cool against my skin, the sun beginning its descent. Shadows stretched long across the lawn, a gentle reminder of the passage of time and the persistence of justice. I walked back to my porch, the weight of the ordeal lifting with each step. I settled into my chair, the satisfaction not in Karen's downfall, but in the restoration of balance. The firewood in my yard stood as a silent testament, a monument not to revenge, but to resilience. Sometimes, the strongest actions are quiet, like ants hollowing out a log, unnoticed until it collapses. The morning after the woodpile debacle was crystalline in its clarity. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shadows that danced on the ground like restless spirits. I stood at my kitchen window, a mug of coffee cradled in my hands, peering out at the world that seemed both unchanged and yet irrevocably different. The neighborhood buzzed with a quiet anticipation, a subtle shift in the air that suggested the climax of our peculiar drama was nigh. Karen, it seemed, had retreated into her fortress of denial, her house a silent sentinel against the tide of communal disdain. The ants, I imagined, had already begun their conquest of her pristine palace, tiny warriors marching under the banner of poetic justice. The irony was not lost on me. A lesson in humility delivered by nature's smallest architects. I could almost hear the collective sigh of the neighborhood, a symphony of relief and vindication. It resonated in the rustling trees, the chirping birds, the whispering winds. I took another sip of coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of petty thefts and strategic retaliations. A game of chess played with firewood and insects, yet today brought a peculiar peace, a sense of closure that settled over the community like a soft blanket. As if on cue, I noticed the first neighbor emerge from their home. It was Dave from 2 doors down. His gait unhurried, his expression relaxed. He paused, surveying the street, and gave a slight nod and unspoken acknowledgement of our shared journey, our quiet rebellion against the tyranny of Karen's reign. He was soon joined by others, each stepping out into the cool embrace of the morning, their faces bright with the anticipation of a new beginning. Reflecting on Karen's fall from grace, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Her missteps had been many, her hubris vast, yet, in the end, she was but a single character in our tapestry, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of our lives. Perhaps, in time, she would find her way back to humility and kindness. Perhaps not. Either way, the community had spoken, and its message was clear. Respect and cooperation would triumph over pettiness and greed. The day unfolded slowly, a montage of simple pleasures and unspoken camaraderie. Neighbors exchanged smiles, brief nods, and knowing glances. Weeds were pulled, lawns trimmed, and, in an act of quiet defiance, a new stack of firewood appeared at the edge of my yard, donated by hands unseen, delivered with the silent promise of solidarity. As evening descended, casting long shadows across the street, I found myself reflecting on the tangled web of decisions that had brought us here. It was a reminder that power, real power, lay not in control but in community, in the connections we forged, the bridges we built, the trust we nurtured. A gentle breeze whispered through the open window, carrying with it the scent of earth and anticipation. The stars began their nightly vigil, twinkling with the promise of endless possibilities. And so, our little corner of the world returned to its rhythm, a place where disputes were settled with quiet resilience, and the future was shaped by the choices of its people. The ants, meanwhile, would find their way, just as we had, perhaps in Karen's heart. A seed of change was germinating, or perhaps she remained as she was, untouched by the lessons of the earth and sky. Only time would tell, but for now, the world felt right once more.